Any nine 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 nine. Any nine 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 nine. Any nine 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 nine. Any nine 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 nine. Any nine 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 nine. Any nine 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 nine. Any nine 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 nine. Any nine 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 nine. Any nine 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 nine.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome. This class is an introduction to Shemitah, the Jewish sabbatical year that we are now in the midst of. So hopefully that is what you are all here for. My name is Ben Merrick. I'm the managing editor of My Jewish Learning, and it is great to have you with us today. Our presenter today is Rabbi Zelig Golden, who is a founder and executive director of Wilderness Torah, which is an organization dedicated to awakening the earth-based traditions of Judaism. In just a moment, I will share a link to the source sheet that Rabbi Golden will be teaching from this morning in the chat. And without further ado, I want to welcome Rabbi Zelig Golden.
Shalom, shalom. Thank you so much for having me here today, and welcome everyone. Welcome. I hope and pray that everyone is well, that your families are well. I'm broadcasting from my home office on my family's home in Occidental, California, about an hour north of San Francisco. And what a time we're in, no? It is the COVID pandemic is pushing us further into isolation again. I'm very aware of that because my own family right now has members suffering with COVID. Everyone's okay, thank God, but it seems to be finding its way everywhere right now. And what I hope to share today is a little bit about how we orient towards resilience, how we orient towards a deeper relationship with land, how and ecological sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability. Shmitah, release, the seventh year. So that's where we're going today. But before we go any further, I would love to invite you to simply share in the chat your name, where you're coming from, and if you want, like the briefest phrase of like why you're here, to orient to what this temporary community of learners is and what we want to do together. So again, I'm Zelig, Occidental California, and I'm here to share the fruits of Shemitah with you. Who are you? Why are you here? Hi from Miami, Florida, Los Angeles, California. Hi, Susan. Hi, Audrey. Salinas, Kansas, I believe. Hi, Eric. Molly from Grapevine, Texas. Mike from Des Moines, Iowa. To learn. Fredericksburg, Virginia. Hi, Sabina. Welcome, everyone. Wow, this is exciting. We're here from all over the country, all the way to Alaska, to Wiltshire, UK. Good morning, or good evening, perhaps, as the case may be. We have Ishmael from Mexico and Marina from Sao Paulo, Brazil. This is wonderful. I want to welcome you all. I won't be able to acknowledge each and every one of you, but I want to welcome each and every one of you. So keep that coming. And Serena's right here near home in Tucson City, Bay Area. Great. And Lavia says, I'm interested in Wilderness Torah and finding a place in it. Great. So maybe I'll share a little bit about Wilderness Torah as well, perhaps towards the end. So what is this Shemitah that we have all gathered around? We're in the Shemitah year. The Shemitah year is the seventh year of a 7-year cycle. Shemitah literally means release. To release. And in the Torah, we release the land, we release debt, and we release people from servitude. So I'm curious to maybe you don't have to have an answer to this question, but before I jump in to share my response to what this is and take you into the text, what do you suppose this has to do with rest, renewal, and resilience today for us? And if you have any sense of what that might be, you can share a thought in the chat. I'm going to share a lot about that in a few moments, but I thought I might just invite you to share what your sense of Shemitah is before we begin. It might also give me a sense of where to take you in this brief hour. Ishmael says, thank you, to reflect and be ready for a new cycle. And indeed, to play on this, Ishmael, I think this is exactly right. And one of my deepest joys about Judaism as a religion, as a cultural format, as a way of life really, is the way Judaism orients us to honor cycles, daily cycles, weekly cycles, monthly cycles with the fluctuations of the moon. We have 7-week cycles, multiple 7-week cycles in the calendar. And then we have the rainy season, the dry season, so half-year cycles, the annual cycle. And then we have 7-year cycles. We have 49-year cycles. And then we have 2,000-year cycles. And we have 7,000-year cycles. So the Hebrew calendar is very rich with the cycles. And for me, it's an instruction. It's a way of life, but that way of life is an instruction on how to honor the cycles of our lives and the cycles of the natural world, and in particular, the relationship between the two. Bonnie says it's a time to rest, renew, and restore, and I want to say exactly. And we're going to dive right into the instructions on resting, renewing, and restoring. But to give away part of the conclusion, Shmitah, to release, is instructing us to let go of control 1 out of 7 years. And if we can let go 1 out of 7 years, what does that mean for the 6 years that we are in, let's say, normal life? To be wild, to reclaim some of our wildness, and also, and perhaps most importantly, to allow the land to have its rest, renewal, and restoration. Because as Sabina says, the land is not ours, and that is perhaps the deepest teaching of all. So let's dive right into the text. I'm seeing so many beautiful teachings coming through, and again, unfortunately, I will not have the opportunity to touch on all of them. But continue to learn from each other in the chat. I encourage you, if you have questions, populate them in the chat as we go, and as I am able, I'm watching, and I will pause and respond. And again, I may not be able to respond to all of them, so my apologies in advance. So what is the Shemitah year? I should get a thumb if you're seeing my screen. Great, okay. So the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, in the books of Shmot, in Hebrew, which means names, we call Exodus because it's recounting the Exodus story. It's the very book we are in right now. It offers us what I would call a sacred instruction, a core mitzvah, a core commandment. Mitzvah, commandment, or mitzaveh, a little bit of a wordplay in Aramaic, an opportunity to connect, an opportunity to make a strong connection. V'shesh shanim tizra et artzecha, safta et tuata. 6 years you shall sow your land, meaning put seeds in the ground and gather its yield. But in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave, let the wild animals eat it. And you shall do the same with your olive vineyards and your grape vineyards. So what is the Torah telling us here? It says that for 6 years, we are active farmers engaging in and controlling the ecology around us, at least that part of it that we farm. But that 1 in 7 years, we are obligated to release Shemitah and let it rest. So what does that look like? Well, we know that in our ancient tradition, we are wheat farmers, amongst other things. Wheat is the crop that we celebrate and honor at the Shavuot, that early summer festival, the second of the three big festivals, to make bread, the most sacred of our foods that we put on the altar in ancient times. So we are cultivating the wheat and other crops for the 6 years. So too, we are known as vintners, ancient grape growers and winemakers, to make the holiest of holy beverages, the one we raise up on every simcha, be it Shabbat or a major holiday, a bar mitzvah, a rites of passage of all kind, Havdalah, the ending of Shabbat, that we tend our vineyards for 6 years. But on the 7th year, the wheat fields, we are instructed, are to go fallow. We are not to sow, we are not to reap, and we are not to cultivate, not to plant seeds, not to harvest, and not to till and tend, as we are instructed to do. So why? Why might this be so? And I want to go to the grape field. So if your vineyards look beautifully organized in year 1 through 6, then this might be what a grape vineyard looks like in year 7. Why? Why do we Shemitah? Why do we release the land from our control? Why do we give it this year? And what happens to us when we do that? What happens to us when we do that? Any considerations? Everything and everybody needs and requires rest. Thank you, Susan. Absolutely. So we will get to the relationship between Shabbat, the 7th day of the week, and Shemitah, the 7th year of the 7-year cycle, because the 7th, be it the 1 day a week or 1 year out of 7, there is a deep relationship between Shabbat. Shabbat, the 7th day of the year, the day we rest, because God, after having spent 6 days of working to create the world, on the 7th day God rests. And so too, we are instructed to observe Shabbat. Well, then the instruction is for the land to have its rest. And then as Shula is saying, then we can also rest. Absolutely. What is a human being if we are only a human doing? And what's the relationship then between land and human? As Ronnie says, we are totally dependent on nature alone providing for us. I agree completely. But not only are we dependent on nature for providing for us, I want to take that even deeper. I don't know if it's Ronnie or Ronnie, so forgive me if I've mispronounced your name, doing my best. But it's not just that we depend on nature, it's that we are nature indeed. In Bereshit, in Genesis, the creation story says that the Creator made Adam, min Adama. Adam, the earthling, is from Adama, the earth. Notice Adam and Adama are almost identical words. The only difference is the hey at the end of the word. It's the same root. It's really the same thing linguistically, because we're pointing towards not just a likeness, not just a dependence, but an inextricable connection. Adam, Adama, the human, the earthling, each of us is an earthling, is from the earth, is the earth itself. And then it says that Adam min afar, that the human is, the earthling is created from the dust of the earth, and then the spirit is blown in with the wind or the breath of life. Human beings are the earth. So when we let the land rest, we rest ourselves. When we rest ourselves, we let the land rest. There is a deep interdependence relationship. Sabine says we don't own the land, so we show respect and love by allowing it to rest. Absolutely. There's a deep relationship. There also is this separateness that we control the land if we choose to. We also tend the land if we choose to. And here is the opportunity to show respect for the land. To humble ourselves and not take anything for granted. Amen. Josie agrees. In our modern life, how do we observe Shemitah? And that is where we're going. And if we don't take care of the earth, who will? There's more to life than our own needs, says Diana. And I think this is exactly the problem. Now, the real question we have to ask is, was the Shemitah, was the seventh year, indeed and actually ever fully observed? And this is a question that we do not have a sufficient answer to. In fact, it is likely that the answer is no, that the Shemitah was never fully observed in the ideal that it presents. So if it was never observed fully, why are we even talking about it? And this, I believe, really gets to the question that Lois is asking. In our modern life, how do we observe Shemitah? That Shemitah is sacred law. And as sacred law, it is an aspiration. It is an aspiration to bring us into the deepest and most profound relationship. And in modernity, in an age of climate catastrophe, which I believe we are entering, I think there is a growing consensus that that is the case. Perhaps Shmitah is a deep ancestral teaching that is waiting for us to fully embrace and discover. Every tradition, my Rebbe says, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi says, has a medicine for the planet, each in its own time. And perhaps one of the core medicines of the Jewish people to the world at this time is Shemitah. And we'll get to how Shemitah becomes not just an instruction on what we do and don't do, but as a core design principle. Okay. So we've talked a little about the ecology. Let's go back into the source sheet. In addition to the law of Shemitah calling on us to release the land 1 out of 7 years, Miketz shva shanim ta'aseh Shemitah, in Deuteronomy, every 7th year you shall practice a remission of debt. This shall be the nature of the remission. Every creditor, the one who loans money, shall remit the due that he claims from his fellow. Now, granted, this is the masculine language here, and I want to acknowledge that. This is very old text, 3,500 years plus, and so we must update that and say the one, or we, or they, but this is how it comes to us. They shall not dun his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord. So God is commanding, some higher power, sacred law is commanding that we remit debt every 7th year. Interestingly, you may dun the foreigner, but you must remit whichever is due from your kinsman. There shall be no needy among you, since God will bless you. If you only heed God and take care to keep all this instruction that I enjoin you this day, then there will be consequence. So I must say that one of the approaches I take to Torah when I read it is like, what do I feel in my kishkas, in my soul, is deeply true, and which parts do I need to update? Again, my teacher Reb Zalman taught us that in this time of deep change, he called the paradigm shift, we must root ourselves deeply in our ancient tradition. We must upgrade the spiritual technologies and understandings as required by the times. And revelation must remain open so we can discover things anew. So as I look at this Torah, I'm also going to not just evolve the gender of the language. I'm also going to say I want to go beyond just my kinsman and include the foreigner as a move towards broader peacemaking, broader equity, broader inclusivity in a time of the necessity of true diversity and true justice. I would want to update this piece of Torah to say, what would it be like to look at economic debt in relationship to all people? Now, what does that actually mean? Does it actually mean literally that we will, every 7th year, give money back that was owed? That is the pshat. That is the literal instruction from Torah. And maybe that is exactly what we do. But perhaps there's another approach. And so, one valence of the relationship between the ecology of Shemitah, resting the land, and the economy of Shemitah is how we move towards justice. Climate justice is one example, perhaps in my mind the primary example for our time, which includes all justices. But if there is an abuse of the land and a profound inequity relating to the distribution of wealth amongst peoples, according to socioeconomic status, according to race, according to geography, according to other types of identities, how is it possible that humanity can find its way through a global catastrophe like the climate change catastrophe? I do not know. And again, it's an ideal that the Torah calls us to. So Shemitah, in relationship to the economic valence, might be a foundational text for calling for economic reparations with those communities with whom, centuries old, millennial old harm has been done. That would be a very interesting and powerful conversation to relate ecological justice and economic justice vis-a-vis reparations. So just one example of how we might apply Shemitah in a modern context. I'm going to pause here and see if anyone wants to respond to the economy of Shemitah and the admonishment to release debt every 7 years. What does this bring up for you? So Bonnie said that U.S. bankruptcy law is based on this. Indeed, perhaps it's the bankruptcy law is not such a high ideal, but that it is a safeguard for those who fall into economic trouble, that there is a way in which our debts can be released when we hit rock bottom. I would say that's a safeguard. Shmitah, in relationship to economic debt, though, is calling on something more proactive, talking about the interrelationship between kinsmen, community members. I would like to expand that to say, what is it like to distribute resources more equitably? That seems to be the basic principle. So whether or not it's literally every 7 years we release debt, how do we talk about the distribution of resources equitably? I believe that is how I can interpret Shemitah for a modern context. Any other thoughts from you? Okay. Oh, here we go. So again, Ronnie, colonial exploitation of native lands, pollution of urban areas. Absolutely. Thank you. I think this is another potentially profound application of the economic valence of Shemitah, both in relationship to land and in relationship to economy. We have the colonization of indigenous lands. Now, this has happened across the planet. I live in California. I live in Sonoma County, which is about an hour north of San Francisco, in between the villages of Occidental and Freestone. The land that my family has title to, I'm not going to say own it because I don't know what that really means, but the land that my family has title to is coastal Miwok and southern Pomo land. Wilderness Torah, as a nonprofit organization based in the Bay Area, is about to develop the Center for Earth-Based Judaism at Camp Newman, a URJ, Reformed Jewish summer camp, in the hills of Sonoma County outside of Santa Rosa, on Onatsatis land. What does it mean to be in the diaspora, be a Jewish person living in California on lands that were colonized not that long ago, 130 years ago, 120 years ago in this region? That is only a few generations ago. What is the relationship between ancient Jewish scripture and deep values for releasing the land, remitting debt? And I will also say, which we're not going to go into too deeply today, but the Yovel, the Jubilee. How many of you have heard of the Jubilee? Just a hand. I see some hands popping up. So the Jubilee, the Yovel, is the 50th year in a 50-year cycle. 7 Shemitah cycles. So we go Shemitah, 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 And on the 50th year, the Torah instructs that we remit land to its original owner. Whoa! So in terms of land rematriation, the returning of colonized lands to First Nations peoples, which is a movement that is exploding across the world. And I know of this particular story here in California. There are many, not just conversations about, but money being raised and land being given back to First Nations people. What would it mean for the Jewish community to endeavor and build bridges with local First Nations peoples wherever you are? Be it, I believe Arapaho people in Texas, or the Oneida in New York, or the I'm thinking of Alaska and the Haida, the Miwok here in California. These are all peoples who had never had title to land, because there was not land ownership of that, but had a relationship to land. What would it mean? Not necessarily to give back all the land, because that might be unrealistic, but under the premise of Shmitah and Yovel, to learn how to come back into right relationship with First Nations people and empower them. This is a deep exploration and conversation. Now, Shula says there's a problem because people can take on debt knowing that they will not have to repay. Totally. Now, the rabbis wrestle with this, and they say that essentially that debt cycles would have to be considered, and there's a struggle on how to do that, and that it comes down to relationship. So the letter of the law of Shemitah, when it comes to land, and let's even go as deep as land remation to Indigenous peoples, it's not a black and white move or debt release. Someone loans money to me in the year 6 because I need the money to do X, Y, or Z. In year 7, I'm out. Well, that might not totally be the spirit of the law of Shemitah. So then there's a call to deeper relationship. Principles, values, deep relationship. That, I believe, is what Shemitah is calling us to. Erica asked the question, how does this apply to the land of Israel versus everyone else? Thank you, Erica, for asking that question. So Shemitah is a fascinating principle as the rabbis have construed it. There are 3, and I haven't gotten to the third aspect yet. I will in a moment, related to society. I've talked about ecology, economy, next to society. But in terms of the ecology, Shemitah only applies to the land of Israel, within the boundary of the land of Israel, halachically, according to Jewish law. So, well, that might be like, well, I'm off the hook. Time to jump off Zoom. I don't agree, because number one, Shemitah, I don't think, and the rabbis probably totally agree, not totally, but mostly agree, that Shemitah has actually never been fully embraced, embodied, and practiced even within the boundaries of the law in the land of Israel. That early on, in the re-movement towards establishing the state of Israel, for example, and even going back into ancient days, there were ways around Shemitah. The rabbis have their ways, build their loopholes. So one example, and this is getting into the 201 Shemitah course, so I won't go too deep into it, but the Cheter Mechira. The Cheter Mechira is a loophole, kind of like on Passover. When you have all your bread and all your bulk grain that you don't want to toss out, you wrap it up in a bag, you stuff it in the shelf, you tape it, and then you sell it to your friend down the street for $5 temporarily, and then you buy it back after Passover. Well, that's exactly what they did with Shemitah in the land. Cheter Mechira says that you can take your farm, sell it to your non-Jewish neighbor, your Arab neighbor, or your Bedouin neighbor, or whoever is your Christian neighbor, and then after the Shemitah year, you can buy it back. So basically, you're farming the land for your friend until the Shemitah year ends. So even inside the land of Israel, they created the loopholes because, they decided they didn't have the faith. That's my interpretation. They didn't have the faith to practice Shemitah. Now, it's easy to say in modernity when I can go to the grocery store and buy my food. But what would it mean to design for Shemitah? And I'll get there towards the end. Now, in terms of the other principles, the economic and the societal principles, these apply. They aren't connected to the land; they're connected to the people. So, economic remission of debts and the release of servitude, which we'll get to next, those apply to the people. So, they would apply anywhere in the world where you are in relationship to your kinspeople, and that's how Shemitah works. The land follows the land, economy and society follows the people. All right. So now we are gonna go. I'm looking at the chat, and I'm just well. I want to respond to Jan. Yeah, we it's important that we're acknowledging the indigenous peoples all across the planet, and I saw this note, and I want to say, number one, I was out of college. I was a park ranger in Alaska. My first job was to work in the Kenai Fjords National Park on the outer coast of Alaska. Sorry, my computer did something funny. I hope I'm back. Okay, and I really I fell in love with the land, but I also had the opportunity to work with a native tribes person, an amazing woman who we worked in partnership, the National Park Service and the tribe, to patrol the coastline in partnership. And from a very early age, in my early 20s, I began the process of learning about indigenous peoples and the importance of understanding how badly they have been treated, how their their cultures have been almost extinguished across North America and across the globe, and that they still live and that their traditions are still alive and they still have relationships to the plant communities and the animal communities. And yet they are struggling to learn how to assimilate into American society and other societies. And I'm pausing here because of Jan's comment, but also because Shemitah, I believe, in its essence, is an ecological sustainability principle, but also a cultural and economic sustainability principle, which points to relationship with indigenous people. So therefore, it's an indigenous people solidarity principle. That's a deep understanding of Shemitah. And so let me take you into the next valence of Shemitah so we can grok what I'm saying. All right, I'm going to jump into my screen share again. And I just want to let you know that this source sheet that I'm using is on Safaria, and it's for everyone to use. It's publicly available, and thanks for providing that for everyone in the chat if you haven't already, or maybe do it again as people are coming in. So, we've talked about economic justice and debt, and now we turn towards the admonishments in relationship to society as a whole. Ki tikne eved ivri shanim ya'avod v'shvi'it yetze l'chavshi chinam. When you acquire a Hebrew eved, a slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go free without payment. Now we pause here on the word eved, slave. It is my understanding, although I do not have personal knowledge of this, that to be a Hebrew eved, what is translated here by Safaria and most English translations of Torah as slave, is very different than what you would see and what we've experienced in the North American slave trade, for example, and what the history is of the African American community here in the United States in particular. And I want to pause and acknowledge that dark history with the deepest acknowledgement of the pain that goes with that. And so I do believe we shall apply this principle to servitude of all kinds and slavery, and yet probably this is not the same kind of slavery. Probably to be an eved in Hebraic times meant to be an indentured servant. And there are many examples actually of people choosing perennial servitude for various reasons. But this principle is very potent as a third pillar of Shemitah. That when you become indentured for reasons that are, my understanding, were often voluntary, but not always, the principle applies that in the 7th year, that eved, that servant, goes free and clear. and that it was the ending of that one's servitude. In Deuteronomy, a similar principle: if the fellow Hebrew man or woman is sold to you, he or she shall serve for 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall set that one free. So servitude is something that happened. We can say that is happening in society in different ways today. This is not the time to go deep into a conversation about servitude and Shemitah, but to say the principle is that servitude cannot be something for life, but is only temporary, and in the Shemitah year, this servitude is released. So what does this mean? Some would apply the notion of Shemitah, often called sabbatical, to even how we consider the labor force in our workplaces, in our corporations, in our organizations, that instituting on the deepest level, it is calling for, I believe, the ending of servitude, because perennial servitude, slavery, in fact, is simply impermissible in Jewish tradition. Perennial servitude is not possible because Shemitah requires us, whether voluntary or not voluntary, to release an eved, a servant, in the 7th year. And in the modernity, we could look at how we apply Shemitah and labor to the workforce. So, for example, as the executive director of Wilderness Torah, I have been with the organization for 14 years. I encourage you, by the way, to look up Wilderness Torah at some point, wildernesstorah.org, and see what I'm talking about. It's the awakening of earth-based traditions. But Shemitah is at the base of that. So in my 14th year now, I am taking my family on a 6-week vacation. It should be 3 months, really, but it'll be 6 weeks this year. But 7 years ago, in my first Shemitah, my first 7th year of a 7-year cycle, I took half of a year and went to Israel and studied. That was part of my rabbinical studies. But the principle is that every 7 years, I am getting a big break from the commitment and the work that I do. Now, as a nonprofit organization, we have 13 staff, slowly growing, and we are now instituting a sabbatical policy, a Shmitah policy, that anyone in the organization who works for up to 7 years, when they make it to their 7th year, they get 3 months off. So you take 3 months, that's paid, that's an earned Shemitah. People burn out. And let's be real, why are we working anyways? We're working to live, we don't live to work. So Shemitah is inviting us to remember what it means to be a human being. Rest, renewal, resilience requires that we take time in our lives to be with ourselves, to be with our families, to be with the community, to be with the earth. Imagine if the entire planet had a sabbatical policy. Imagine if American labor law required that every employee of any corporation, business, nonprofit, you name it, got a 3-month break or a 6-month break, or wow, an entire year every 7 years. What would the world look like? What would the world look like? Let's reflect on that for a moment. If we had a true policy of sabbatical culture in our labor laws. And while you're commenting that, I'm going back to the chat. I'm 5 minutes late on a few of these comments, but Shannon asked, were enslaved women not to go free? The answer is yes, they would go free. In Deuteronomy 15:12, that source I showed you earlier, says it explicitly. If a fellow Hebrew man or woman is sold to you, he or she shall go free. It says he, but the Hebrew is tricky there. It would apply to both. Sabine is talking about the immigrants who work in agriculture. Imagine if, and sure, we could look at different kinds of labor in the American labor market, whether we're talking about agricultural workers, which are disproportionately Latinx people, immigrants from the South, the bordering South, or whether we're talking about the prison population, which is disproportionately African American, Black and brown people in America, let's be real about that. There is labor happening there too. What if we applied a deep labor principle to every context where labor is happening? Yeah, the Torah is amazing. Thank you, Josie. Okay. I'm going to pause for a moment. I feel like I'm feeding you through a fire hose as I do. And are there any clarifying questions? Because what I've done now is I've laid out a basic framework for Shemitah, the 7th year, in ecological terms, in economic terms, and in societal terms related to labor and servitude. I see, is that a hand from Marianne? No? So the question from Ishmael is, the release of debt and people applies only to the land of Israel, just like the release of earth. And no, Ishmael, to clarify, only the release of the land applies only to the land of Israel. Halachically speaking, the rabbis have interpreted Shemitah to apply anywhere we, if you're Jewish, the Jewish people are. So in relation to economy and society, it applies even outside the land of Israel. Lori says there would be a more just society. Workers would be happier, there'd be a higher quality of life, and there'd be improved mental health. Amen, Lori. Thank you. You nailed it. And I would also say that it probably would be higher productivity. It would probably be not just a more just society, but a more peaceful society. And people would just simply be happier. And Molly asks, were you going to talk about it? Does it to spiritually and personally to observe Shemitah? Yes, Molly. Thank you for teeing up my exact next step. So let me dive right into that. Here we go. Here we go. So, what does it mean to fail to observe Shemitah? And how do we know that, in fact, Shemitah probably was not actually totally observed, if observed at all? Well, in Leviticus, the 3rd book of the 5 books of Moses, says, and I will scatter among the nations. I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword against you. Your land shall become desolation, and your cities ruin. Then shall the land make up for its Sabbath. The land shall make up for its sabbatical, its Shmitah, throughout the time that it is desolate and you are in the land of your enemies. Throughout the time that it is desolate, it shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years while you were dwelling on it. Hello. So the Torah explains, and this is a spiritual principle, but I would also call this an ecological principle, a pragmatic principle, a social principle, that if we do not honor Shemitah by failing to honor the land, the economy, and society, the land will spit us out. And my friends, what happened 2,000 years ago? For the second time, we were exiled, and in some ways, although the state of Israel now exists, and we're not going to go too deep into that politic, many people say and believe that the Hebrew people remain in exile. In Pirkei Avot, which is the Mishnaic code, this is the codification of ancestral oral tradition around 200 AD, approximately 130 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, when the Great Exile began. Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, the rabbis say exile comes to the world for idolatry, sexual sins, bloodshed, and for transgressing the commandment of Shemitah. So by failing to observe Shemitah, exile comes. Something like this. The land responds to our failure to be in right relationship with it. Drought, war, conquest by other peoples. It comes in mysterious ways. You might say the ineffable, the unseeable, or maybe it's just a matter of balance of physical properties in the world. This is where earth and spirit meet, regardless of your cosmology, whether you believe in a deity God or whether you just simply believe in the science of action consequence in the world. I think it's the same thing. the Torah is pointing towards a deep and profound wisdom. That when you take care of the land takes care of you. And when you fail to take care of the land, well, that's what happens. And so to turn towards the aspiration, because we know that exile has happened, and we know that we are in a time where the consequence of exile is catastrophic. Now I turn towards the notion of exile, not just as the story of the Jews being kicked out of their ancestral land, but exile as a human condition in modernity. The microcosmic story of Jews losing the temple and being kicked out of Israel, yes, and then returning, although how is an important question. Applying the concept of exile and the failure of Western modern societies to tend to land everywhere. The failure to tend well to people everywhere, to those we colonized and conquested, to those we enslaved. This is a direct violation of Shemitah and the equity principles it calls upon. Sure, this is Jewish law, but perhaps this is Jewish law which is calling humanity to a deep sacred principle. Recall, the Christian world too has adopted the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as its Old Testament. So these principles aren't just for Jews. Perhaps these are universal principles the world over. And if we turn towards the aspiration, the deep aspiration of Shemitah, it says, when you enter the land that I assign you, shall observe the Sabbath. 6 years you may sow and prune, but in the 7th year you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of God, a full rest for you, which is the same thing. You, God, the land, you, it's all one and the same. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or grapes. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land, but you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. So the relationship in the 7th year does not end. We can still take and eat from the land, but we do so freely that everything that comes forth on the 7th year is hefker. It is ownerless. It is as if all humans drop into equality. Very challenging, but a very powerful principle. Now, what if we designed our agricultural systems based on this principle? What if we designed our economic systems based on this principle? What if we had a society that had this value at its foundation? Things would be very different. "6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of God." So just as the 7th year is the Shabbat for the land in Leviticus 25, in Deuteronomy 5, 6 days, it's so Shabbat and Shemitah are together. And like I just love this image of imagining in the 7th day how we rest. Take a moment in the grass and don't till, don't tend, just rest. Wait till a butterfly lands on your nose, or whatever it is that makes you happy. Take a walk in the fields. Well, the great and first chief rabbi of what would become Israel, at the early turn of the century, wrote a book about Shemitah, called it Shabbat Haaretz, the Shabbat of the land. And this is one of the things, one of my favorite things he says. This book I would admonish you to pick up and read. I don't see it rapidly, sorry, but Shabbat Haaretz, hazon.org. You can find a beautiful translation of the introduction to Shabbat Haaretz by Rav Kook, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. And he says this: what Shabbat does for the individual, what the 7th day of the week does for the individual, Shmitah does for humanity. The soul of people in the land intertwine, working from the base of their being to bring into existence the intricate patterns of inner holiness that lie within. During Shemitah, the year of release, the pure inner spirit may be revealed. Human beings will return to a state of natural health, so that they will not need healing from sickness, which mostly befalls us when the balance of life is destroyed and our lives are distant from the rhythms of nature. So Shemitah, like Shabbat, is designed to bring us back into a rhythm of nature. Shemitah, I would argue, is the foundational principle for building human resilience. Here is a midrash, a rabbinic tale, an interpretation from Leviticus, riffing on one of the Psalms that says, heroes of power, performers of their word. About what does this verse speak? And Rabbi Yitzchak, one of the ancient rabbis, this is about those who keep Shemitah. Heroes of power, performers of their word, the ones who observe the sacred law. Rabbi Yitzchak says, about those who keep Shemitah, the sabbatical year, the verse is speaking. In the normal custom of the world, a person performs a mitzvah, something really good to do, for one day, for a week, a month. Wow. But not for the whole year. And here they guard their field and their vineyard and pay their taxes and are silent for an entire year. Is there a greater hero than this? So Rabbi Yitzchak is saying from the Midrash that imagine a society that has the discipline, that has the deep value to embrace a 7-year cycle where we completely alter our lives. What would it take to design a world like that? Well, what Rabbi Yitzchak is saying is that, first of all, the people would be incredible. To raise up a generation of people who knew that Shemitah, honoring land, honoring people, economy, and society in this way, would breed a whole resilient kind of person. And finally, and this was a question I saw in the chat earlier, I don't recall who asked it, but this is, to me, sorry, I'm messing around with the source sheet, don't mean to do that. This is the great punchline, that Shemitah is the ultimate design principle. Because Shemitah is not necessarily about the 7th year at all. But the way Shemitah calls us to conduct ourselves in the 7th year, to rewild ourselves, to be in relationship with the wild nature, to harvest food from the fields without doing the toil, without doing the work. What would be required in the first 6 years in every cycle? What kind of agricultural systems would we create? Would we simply grow potatoes and wheat and tomatoes and beans, annual crops that require tilling and tending every single year? Or would we move to something more resilient, more ecologically sustainable? Something that in the 7th year would then bear the kind of fruit and the kind of food that would be necessary to sustain our families, communities, and humanity as a whole. I think the question answers itself. And then how would you apply the same principles to the resilience of an economic system, the resilience of a labor system? And what would that do for society as a whole and how we might rest, how we might renew ourselves, and the resiliency that it would create? So I pause there. And I open the last 5-6 minutes for any kind of questions or comments. Let's pop at the chat, and I'm going to track it carefully here. Sabine says, what comes to mind is trust and allowing. I love this, that this points us to deep values. What are the deep values? Trust, allowing. I'm sure we could come up with more, so thank you for that. Naomi is speaking about taking time off from having children, especially in societies where more children you have, the more honor you get. Interesting question, how this relates. There's a whole dialogue that happened here. Okay, well, I'm not gonna try and catch fully up with that, but are there any other questions or comments? So Sarah brings up the concept of permaculture, and I want to say a big amen to that. Permaculture. Permaculture is a modern compilation of a variety of very old, likely mostly indigenous approaches to ecological, agricultural, economic, and societal sustainability approaches. How do we create regenerative systems that sustain themselves? So in this image I provided to you, this is an image of a permaculture food forest. Instead of growing annual crops year after year after year, what would it be like to grow systems that can perpetuate themselves, of course, with our support and tending, but that could truly bear fruit and feed populations in the 7th year without us having to toil so much? Imagine if we had small and medium scale systems like that across the planet. That could actually sustain humanity in the way Shmitah is calling us. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Shannon says, a year to take a break from patterns that entrench us, that harm us in harm to equity. Totally. This would be a pattern breaker. I interpret Shmitah in this way. Humans are humans. We do, we work, we toil. It is part of our nature. And it is also important to recognize that we have a human nature. That part of being human is also being nature. So in a way, Shmitah says, maybe it's 1/7 of us needs to stay wild. So what would it be like to take a break and to break the patterns? And the real question is, how would we pay for it? User is getting very pragmatic. And I would say a few things. Number one, we have to change our systems dramatically. Our consumerism patterns would have to change. This is pointing us probably to a slightly or maybe radically different economic model. Capitalism and Shmitah do not go well together, my friend. Local regional systems that are regenerative and sustainable, based on collaboration and based on a deeper sense of trust, as was spoken earlier, that, my friend, is how we would pay for it. Deep relationship rather than competition, exploitation, and consumerism. Shmitah is calling us to a whole new paradigm. As Lucille says, you must organize differently. Agriculture, economy, and society. It's a complete paradigm change of how we think. But my friend, it's not new. This is the ancient Torah. This is the ancient tradition. This is before the rabbis. This is in the DNA of the Hebrew people. We've been carrying this for millennia. And we are at the precipice of humanity destroying itself. Now, I'm not really actually worried about the earth. The earth is resilient and it will go through what it will go through. But if humanity wants to sustain itself, wants to survive, there is a new paradigm that we must embrace. I believe Shmitah is pointing to that paradigm. And Lori asked about that Shmitah was most likely not observed. Again, there were agricultural and economic loopholes that were created, and I believe, Lori, that this is the 201 class, but that loopholes are loopholes, and what really is the question is, what values does Shmitah point us to that we are ready to embrace? Not technical fixes or technical runarounds, but values that change our society. That is my belief. And I think the question for will this recording be available is for the folks at My Jewish Learning. But with that, I'll say thank you so much for doing this hour-long journey with me. And I invite you to take the source sheet, to take the teachings into your communities and spark up a conversation. What would it mean to embrace Shmitah and to change the way we walk, work, learn, live in the world according to ancient Jewish law? Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Golden. And to answer that question, yes, the recording of this class will be available on My Jewish Learning's YouTube page in the coming days, so please check for it there. In the meantime, thank you again, Rabbi Zelig, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.